The gates of Acre shattered. Dust and smoke choked the air as 2,700 Muslim prisoners knelt in rows outside the conquered city. King Richard the Lionheart, crowned King of England barely 2 years prior, stood before them with cold calculation in his eyes. The negotiations had failed. Saladin refused to pay the ransom, refused to return the fragment of the true cross captured at Hattin. Richard raised his hand. What followed would echo through history as one of the most brutal acts of the Third Crusade. By sunset on that August day in 1191, not one prisoner remained alive. This was not the chivalrous crusade of legend. This was total war between two of the greatest commanders medieval history would ever know. And the battle for the Holy Land had only just begun. We're covering the catastrophic collapse at Hattin that set everything in motion, the brutal 653-day Siege of Acre, the desperate gamble at Arsuf, and the final showdown at Jaffa that would determine the fate of Jerusalem. Stay until the end, because the moment Richard faced Saladin's entire army with only 55 knights is the battle nobody expected him to survive. For years earlier, on the 4th of July, 1187, the Christian army had been utterly destroyed at the Battle of Hattin. Saladin, champion of Islam, moved swiftly to reduce the remaining Christian holdings in the Holy Land. Within mere months, Acre, Haifa, Caesarea, Jaffa, and Sidon fell into Muslim hands. In Jerusalem, Balian of Ibelin held out under siege until October, when he surrendered the city. The local Christians in the city were allowed to remain, while others were escorted out, a testimony to Saladin's merciful taking. But the well-fortified port of Tyre remained in Christian hands. Aboard a Genoese ship, a Frankish nobleman from northern Italy, Conrad of Montferrat, was only days away from arriving in Tyre. His successes against the armies of Frederick Barbarossa had brought him fame and prestige, while his personality and handsome appearance made him beloved at the court in Constantinople. Now, with most of the Holy Land lost and much of the Crusader leadership dead or captured, Conrad emerged by chance as the principal Christian leader in the Levant after his arrival in Tyre in mid-July 1187. Beyond the Mediterranean, news of the catastrophic turn of events reached Pope Urban III, who allegedly died from shock upon hearing the news. 9 days later, on October 29, 1187, his successor, Pope Gregory VIII, issued the papal bull Audita Tremendi, which urged a renewed crusade to retake Jerusalem. Despite the catastrophic Second Crusade of the 1140s, interest in the Levant region and maintaining the Crusader states remained strong in the minds of many European rulers. Prince Richard, the future Lionheart, took the cross early, before the papal bull was even issued. His father King Henry II of England and King Philip II of France committed to a new crusade at the urging of Jocelyn, Archbishop of Tyre, who had traveled to Europe from the Holy Land to ensure both kings set aside their disagreements and helped with relief in the east. Philip d'Alsace, Count of Flanders, joined the undertaking immediately afterward. All three men agreed to Henry's proposal to impose a massive crusade tax called the Saladin tithe. By July 6, 1189, however, King Henry II died, leaving his son, the newly crowned King Richard I, to take responsibility for leading the English contingent on the Third Crusade. In Mainz, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa also took the cross and committed the German people to the new crusade. Meanwhile in the Levant, Saladin released Guy of Lusignan from captivity in the summer of 1188. Under the terms of his release, Guy agreed never to take up arms against Saladin again, an oath he quickly betrayed. He led his family and loyal followers to Tripoli, where Balian of Ibelin had taken Christian refugees from Jerusalem. Back in Tyre, Conrad of Montferrat heavily fortified the ancient city and successfully withstood a 7-month siege by Saladin's army. The Sultan, meanwhile, launched a campaign in Syria, conquering city after city and castle after castle. Now in the summer of 1189, Guy gathered troops from Tripoli and Antioch and led his new army south to Tyre. As ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, part of which was Tyre, Guy expected to reside in the city, but Conrad refused him entry. A bitter rivalry soon developed between the two men. Stuck outside Tyre until August 1189, Guy decided he could wait no longer. He turned his army and marched to Acre to attempt to retake the city and establish his base of operations there. With up to 700 knights and 9,000 infantry, Guy advanced along the Scandilian Pass, a coastal road that stood away from the interior where scouting Saracens kept a vigilant eye. But the movements of the Crusaders were eventually noted and information was relayed to Saladin. Curiously, the Sultan hesitated. Holed up in Belfort Castle, a strongly defended stronghold, he questioned whether Guy's move was an elaborate feint aimed at luring him from this good position and making him vulnerable to attacks from north and south. The Crusaders eventually arrived at Acre. Over the following days, they were joined by other contingents descending from the pass, as well as a Pisan force that chose to sail rather than march. Guy and his main host camped on the ancient hill known as Torin, climbing it at night to avoid detection. From Torin, they had a clear view of the city and the plain of Acre below. The position was highly defensible. The eastern edge of Torin fell away steeply, making Guy's camp immune from cavalry charges. Between Torin and the city walls, Guy's main army camped on August 28, 1189, marking the beginning of the Siege of Acre. After learning of the siege, Saladin set out from Belfort Castle with his army, calling for additional soldiers throughout his empire to reinforce him. Men from Mosul, Sinjar, Diyarbakir and elsewhere soon flocked to the Sultan's banner. From his favorable vantage point on Torin, Guy watched as Muslim reinforcements gradually came into view and the Christian warriors prayed to God for help. Saladin made his camp on August 30 at Tel Kaysan, near Acre. The Muslim left wing spread beyond the Belis River, with the right wing extending to Tel Al-Ayadiyah. In front of the main grades was a stationary vanguard, whose orders were to harass the Crusader perimeter on a daily basis and prevent anyone from escaping the siege. Guy's army was now blocked between the defenders of Acre and Saladin's relief army. On September 1, Guy launched an assault on the walls of Acre before most of Saladin's army arrived. Because his siege catapults were not yet complete, Guy relied on his infantry to carry out the assault. They rushed forward with ladders to climb the city walls. From above, defenders shot arrows, threw stones and other projectiles. The Christians climbed and a fierce clash erupted along the ledges. The attack, however, was quickly interrupted as messengers brought news of the approach of Saladin's main army. Fortunately for Guy, reinforcements were on their way, and not just from Tyre. In mid-September, a fleet arrived from the west carrying Danes, Welsh, and Cornish. A day later, a second fleet, led by the Lord of Condé and Guise, James of Avanes, was approaching. 50 strong ships, it carried between 12,000 and 14,000 Flemish, Frisians, Germans, and Bretons. James took control of field operations of the Crusader army after his arrival, sometimes sharing responsibility with Ludwig III, the Margrave of Thuringia. Near the end of the month, more reinforcements arrived from Tyre led by Conrad and Gerardo, Bishop of Ravenna. So many Christian ships were now anchored in the bay and blocking the port of Acre that their masts reminded a Muslim observer of tangled reeds. The Muslim leadership estimated the Crusader force at 2,000 horse and 30,000 foot. Saladin met with his war council and decided it was time to test the strength of the Christians. On the morning of September 14, the Sultan launched an attack on the Christian lines. He hoped to open a hole through the siege works and push through to Acre. But the Crusaders stood firm and held back the Muslim wave. However, Saladin's cavalry noticed a weakness in the enemy line north of the city and reinforced the attack there. After an hour of desperate fighting, the Christians were driven back. Yet they quickly reformed their damaged lines, formed a shield wall mixed with mounted bows and spears, and regained lost ground. 2 days after the battle, Saladin was unable to break the Crusader siege lines. So he chose to extend his lines to surround the besiegers. His cavalry screen opened a line of communication and supply channel with the city, but was unable to stop the steady flow of Christian reinforcements arriving by sea at regular intervals. The heavy ships also brought timber for building heavy siege engines to pound the walls of Acre. More alarming news came to Saladin when he learned that Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa had arrived in Constantinople in August with an army reportedly numbering 200,000 crusaders. The Ayyubid Sultan sent letters to emirs and caliphs across the length and breadth of Muslim lands, pleading for more troops to counter this new Christian threat. To his dismay, he failed to receive additional support. Worse, he found the loyalty of some of his vassals wavering. Some emirs left the Muslim camp to prepare to defend their homeland against Barbarossa. With their numbers and confidence reinforced, the Crusaders under Guy chose to attack Saladin's lines on the morning of Wednesday, October 4th, with the aim of reaching and destroying the Muslim camp at Tel Al-Ayadiyah. The attacking force was arranged in 3 ranks, left, right, and center, with bowmen and crossbowmen in the front line, infantry in the second, and cavalry in the third. Conrad of Montferrat led the left wing of mostly Italians along the coastline with Gerardo of Ravenna. The right wing stretched to the Belus River and was led by Guy. The cavalry on the right wing consisted of the Knights Hospitaller, with Italian and French foot troops and missile troops. The center was near the Muscovine Baccarat, outside the city walls, and was commanded by Andrea of Brienne and Ludwig III, seated in the rear with their knights. The Grand Master Templar Gerard of Rightfort led the vanguard of the center. Catalan and German infantry stood before the Templars. Left in camp as a check against sorties from the Acre garrison was Guy's brother, Geoffrey of Lusignan, accompanied by James of Awakens and his men. Against the Crusaders were the divisions of Saladin's army. On their extreme right wing was the Sultan's nephew, Taqi al-Din. He and his men took position at the end of the line by the sea. To the near right were Saladin's sons Al-Afal and Al-Zahir. The rest of the right consisted of soldiers from Mosul, led by the lord of Hizn Kaifa. The Muslim left wing was more diverse. On the far left, near the Belus River, was a company from Asadiyah and the Mamluks of Asad al-Din Shirkuh, Saladin's deceased uncle. The near left had soldiers from Sinjar, led by Mujahid al-Din Yarankush, more Mamluks and soldiers commanded by Muzaffar al-Din. There were other groups of Kurds. Amir Mujali led the Mirani and Hakkari Kurds, while others were commanded by their chiefs. Saladin rode in the center, accompanied by his regular troops and a personal guard of military slaves. Each wing was defended by a thin line of skirmishers. The battle began at 9 o'clock in the morning, when the Crusaders engaged the Muslim vanguard, quickly dispersing it. The Templars and Hospitallers' cavalry rode through the ranks of enemy infantry and missile troops. Fighting locked for 4 hours. In the afternoon, things shifted when the Italians on the Crusader left wing managed to push forward on the Muslim right, and Taqi al-Din ordered his soldiers to withdraw, attempting a feint to lure the Crusader wing away from the main army. Saladin saw his nephew retire and assumed the worst, sending reinforcements from his center to help him. This was a critical mistake. When they saw the thinned ranks before them, the Crusaders in the center and right moved forward towards Saladin's position, striking the Muslim line in the gap between the center and right wings. The Crusader cavalry charged boldly among the thinned Muslim ranks, and the infantry kept a steady pace behind the cavalry. Christian infantry and cavalry attacked simultaneously, shattering the enemy's second line. A general melee began, with the right wing fleeing toward Tel al-Ayadiyah. Those from the center made either for Kawana, across the bridge to Tiberias, or even Damascus. Those Muslims determined to stay in the fight were cut down. Others were caught in their tents and killed there. However, at this critical moment of battle, the Crusaders entering the Muslim camp chose to plunder the tents for loot, driven by greed and hunger. The plundering stopped the Crusader attack, and all momentum in battle was lost. But the plundering was only the beginning of the disaster. What happened next would turn certain victory into catastrophic defeat and prove that discipline, not bravery, wins medieval battles. Saladin, meanwhile, accompanied by only a few personal attendants, was busy trying to save his army, urging the Mamluks and Kurds on the left wing to return and join the fight, and trying to rally the fleeing remnants from the center ranks. Just then the Crusaders, busy feasting and plundering the enemy camp, saw the Acre garrison finally joining the battle from the city walls. Throughout the day, the battle had favored the Crusaders, but their left wing was now fully engaged between the Acre garrison and Taqi al-Din's men. Saladin seized the opportunity, sending his men forward into the disorganized enemy ranks. His left wing engaged, as did the rallied remnants of the center. Plunderers were caught in tents, those fleeing from behind. As Saladin's left wing wheeled on the center, the remaining Crusaders broke and retreated back toward Acre, with Muslim cavalry close behind. To make matters even worse, the Crusader left wing finally succumbed to pressure and withdrew to camp, allowing the Muslim right wing under Taqi al-Din to turn and strike their flank in a pincer movement. It was a massacre. The battle had turned and the remaining Crusaders fled back toward Acre in a chaotic mass, their enemies in close pursuit. Saladin's men soon reached the outskirts of the Crusader camp, almost pushing toward his tents. But instead, the Muslims withdrew and finally retreated from the field as Geoffrey of Lusignan's reserve force arrived to bolster the shaken Crusader ranks. Casualties in the Battle of October at the Siege of Acre vary depending on the source. However, it can be estimated that around 7,000 Muslim troops and 10,000 Crusader troops were killed in the terrible clash of October 4, 1189. After their loss, the Crusader leadership ordered troops to dig in for an extended siege, as there was little chance of quickly breaking either Saladin's lines or the walls of Acre. The Crusader camp had gained little space to expand as Saladin's army began to reorganize behind them. More naval reinforcements arrived in late October, including numerous barons and 400 Danish warriors accompanied by the nephew of King Canute VI. Now the Crusaders opened defensive trenches on both sides of their tents. They filled these with sharp stakes and metal running along the camp from the bay to the Med. These trenches were faced with earthen walls and wooden palisades. Then came heavy rains and thick fogs, heralding the arrival of winter weather. With the close of 1189, nature brought relief to the Muslims. The harsh winter, though not with snow, brought winds strong enough to blow down the tents atop Turin. Worse, Christian ships could not remain anchored due to harsh conditions. Thus, most of the fleet left in late October, or became fuel for campfires. But the situation in the city was becoming desperate. Cut off from supplies in winter weather, the hungry and desperate Acre garrison opened negotiations with the Crusaders. The terms were simple: they would capitulate in exchange for their lives. However, this was foolishly refused by the Crusaders seeking glory. And fortunately for the garrison, Ayyubid reinforcements were on their way by sea. The brave Muslim admiral Hassam ad-Din Lulu saw a chance to transport men and supplies into Acre without being bothered by the heavy Crusader blockade. On December 17, 1189, he led 50 Egyptian galleys into port, using Greek fire to brush aside the few Crusader ships covering them. The Acre garrison cheered at the arrival of the fleet. The deadlock ended on Easter Sunday, March 25, 1190, when a new Crusader fleet of 50 ships from Tyre, led by Conrad of Montferrat, appeared on the shores of the Med, climbing south toward Acre. Guy of Lusignan and Conrad had reconciled their disagreements, and Conrad was on his way to support Guy's siege camp. Before sailing into Acre's harbor, Conrad's fleet was caught by Muslim ships. The naval battle lasted most of the day, as Greek fire and volleys of arrows and bolts were exchanged. But the Christians managed to drive away the Muslim fleet and deliver much-needed supplies and reinforcements to Guy's camp. Fresh Crusader troops continued to pour in throughout March and April, allowing Guy to organize raids that broke Saladin's supply lines and isolated Acre. The rainy spring days soon turned into the hot summer months, and the wet ground dried. The Crusaders built siege towers with wood brought by Italian merchant ships. For stories tall and capable of holding up to 500 men, these mobile towers rose as high as Acre's walls. They were covered with leather soaked in vinegar and urine, which the Crusaders believed provided protection from the defenders' Greek fire. The towers were ready by the end of April. The sight of the colossal devices struck fear in the Acre garrison, who entered a second negotiation with the Crusaders. Once again, however, the Crusaders refused, believing their siege engines would win them the glorious victory they desired. On May 5, 1190, the Crusaders renewed the assault. As the massive towers boomed forward, archers on platforms fought against Muslim archers on walls. Meanwhile, thousands of Christian peasant soldiers and camp followers rushed to fill the city's moat with stones and brush fascines to allow the towers to pass over the moat. Finally, the bridge from the first tower fell on the city's parapet. The Crusaders inside piled onto the walls. But as they pushed their way further, a most terrible sight unfolded behind them. The defenders loaded their artillery with specially mixed explosive jars of Greek fire and shot them at the wooden towers. All three towers caught fire. For some time the wood cracked ominously before, one by one, the towers collapsed, with everyone inside perishing miserably from the flames. Those Crusaders who managed to assault the walls from the first tower were then cut down to a man and thrown out. The assault of May 5 had failed miserably. Throughout June, both armies clashed for 8 days in a row, the heat baking the growing piles of corpses accumulating around the siege camp and walls. Thick black clouds of flies floated around the dead, and disease gripped both Muslim and Christian camps. For nearly a month afterward, little action took place. Tired of the waiting game, the armed men of the Crusader chose another attack on St. James' Day, July 25. Their goal was to punch through the Muslim lines north of Acre. The initial shock of the Crusader pikemen and peasant clubs caught Saladin's men off guard, who appeared to have been somewhat out of formation. But this was a trap. As the pikemen pushed forward, Saladin's brother, Aladil, lured the poorly trained Christian infantry into his camp. There, the attack gradually turned into plunder and looting of Muslim tents. Saladin then sent Egyptian and Mosul reinforcements to block the enemy in the camp. Worse, the Christian attack was poorly coordinated, with only a few dozen knights joining the charge, led by Ralph d'Autreve, Archdeacon of Colchester. Now the attacking contingent was in serious danger of being wiped out. But Ralph and his band of armored knights managed to carve a path through the Muslim lines to escape, but the damage to the Crusader ranks was terrible, as up to 9,000 fell in this failed attack, including Ralph himself. 3 days later, on July 28, 10,000 Crusader reinforcements arrived in the camp under Henry of Champagne. Henry's contingent was the vanguard of a massive Frankish army on the way to the Holy Land under King Philip II of France. In the autumn of 1190, the English contingent led by Baldwin, Archbishop of Canterbury, disembarked and informed the besiegers that King Richard I of England had set out for the Holy Land. However, it would be some time before Philip or Richard arrived at Acre. Then news reached Saladin that Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa had died on June 10 while crossing a shallow river near Armenia. Although leadership passed to his son Frederick of Swabia, the German contingent of the Crusader army dissolved. Many German nobles returned to Europe, and the few who remained under the Duke of Swabia suffered from hunger and were plunged into battle fighting Muslim Seljuks and Kurdish tribes. Only 5,000 survivors reached Tripoli, eventually moving to join the siege against Acre in October. Back at Acre, for weeks, Henry of Champagne attempted multiple attacks on the city using battering rams and ladders. But the Crusaders' fortunes worsened as Muslim attacks from Acre's gates destroyed Henry's siege engines in early September. In the harbor, the Christian fleet launched an attack of their own. In an attempt to destroy the Muslim harbor defenses, on September 24 they sent explosive fire ships against the Tower of Flies. But just as the ships were about to collide with the tower, the winds suddenly shifted and the ships began to collide with each other. Amid the chaos, some small Muslim raiding ships launched a flight of their own. With thick black smoke engulfing the harbor, they passed virtually unnoticed, their sights set on the specially built and fortified Pisan ship, which they proceeded to set on fire unopposed. By the time the Christians realized what was happening, the Muslim group had already turned and taken the return route. Christian naval supremacy over Acre ended once again with the early onset of cold weather. Throughout the winter of 1190–91, dysentery and starvation ravaged the Crusader camp. Bowel fevers claimed thousands of troops, desperately huddled together in the bitter cold outside the walls of Acre. Henry of Champagne was grief-stricken, barely clinging to life. Frederick of Swabia became ill with malaria and died on January 20, 1191. Food supplies rapidly depleted by early spring, with ordinary soldiers surviving on pieces of grass or chewing bare bones. Mobs gathered to fight over the remains of dead horses, even the innards of animals were eaten by starving troops. Finally, relief came for the Crusaders on April 20, 1191, when King Philip of France disembarked with vital supplies of wheat and corn, as well as fresh soldiers and siege engines. King Richard of England was on his way to Tyre 7 weeks later, on June 8, bringing with him 25 fresh ships from the conquest of the Kingdom of Cyprus. On approach, he briefly engaged a Muslim fleet coming out of the harbor to capture the incoming English reinforcements, but nevertheless succeeded. Philip, 8 years older than Richard, wanted to lead the army based on his leadership experience in France against the English. He preferred to continue a slow and elaborate siege against Acre until it finally capitulated. The Crusader leadership, however, submitted to Richard, nicknamed the Lionheart, who was known as a fierce warrior, famous for leading his men into close battles, hand-to-hand combat. Richard identified his objective immediately, the accursed tower. He had a trebuchet, nicknamed Bad Neighbor, and a heavy catapult owned by the Knights Hospitallers, known as the Stone Thrower, aimed at the accursed tower in the northeast corner of Acre's walls. The rest of the artillery was ordered to hit elsewhere. The bombardment began on June 14. The Templars focused on the eastern walls while the Duke of Burgundy's catapults targeted the northern coastal fortifications. Over time, Richard's siege artillery joined the endless bombardment, but both he and King Philip were sick and bedridden. The Crusader war machines hurled stones beyond the walls into the city's market. Hits from the Hospitaller artillery finally destroyed a section of 30 square meters of wall adjoining the accursed tower. The end of June consisted of light skirmishes outside the city. Saladin's advanced guard probed the rear defenses of the Crusaders while the Christians continued to pound Acre with stones. Muslim hopes for relief from the siege faded, although Saladin received necessary reinforcements in his camp. Matters only worsened for the Muslim defenders as the Christians began to assault the walls starting July 2nd. Richard organized round-the-clock attacks. Wave after wave of infantry, archers and artillery tried to break the city's shattered fortifications. Attempts to climb the walls failed. The exhausting operation came at an ever-increasing cost to men and materials. But Richard was determined. Meanwhile, Philip's engineers tunneled toward the walls. Their goal was to reach the accursed tower. Meanwhile, the artillery bombardment demolished parts of the tower, which opened a gaping hole in the fortifications. Richard's focused fire was finally paying off. Committing every able man who could bear arms to the breach, the Muslim defenders were barely able to fend off the attacking Crusaders. Saladin launched his attacks to relieve the defenders at Acre. But despite fierce and prolonged fighting, his troops could not penetrate the ring of besiegers. Swimmers were sent messages from the city to the assembled emirs, begging for help. A final appeal was sent on July 7th. On July 11th, Philip's engineers dug under the partially demolished accursed tower and successfully destroyed the rest, further widening the gap in the walls. At this point, Acre's defenders were too weak to control the breach. In despair they used Greek fire, killing 40 Crusaders on July 11th. Those were the last Christian casualties of the siege. With the rapid approach of night, no one yet knew that the Siege of Acre had ended. As the sun rose over Acre on July 12, 1191, the siege entered its 653rd day. One of the longest sieges of the Middle Ages finally closed as the city's defenders, against Saladin's wishes, surrendered to the Crusaders. Around 19,000 Christian troops were killed during the terrible siege, with the city garrison losing somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 men and the relief army under Saladin also suffering terribly. The final savage act of the siege occurred after Acre's capitulation. Richard the Lionheart ordered the execution of 2,700 survivors of the Acre garrison, possibly because Saladin had refused to pay 200,400 pieces of gold for their ransom and did not agree to return the piece of the true cross taken at Hattin. By the end of the siege, the split among the Crusader leadership had widened. King Philip of France and Leopold of Austria returned angrily to their countries in Europe, taking their contingents with them. Richard led the battered but victorious Crusader army further into the Holy Land to continue his campaign against Saladin, setting his sights on retaking Jerusalem. The Siege of Acre was only the first bloody chapter of the Third Crusade. The Crusaders' victory in the Siege of Acre in July 1191 opened the way for their march to the city of Jerusalem. As King Richard the Lionheart planned his next move, the Crusaders rested in the conquered city of Acre, which was divided into military quarters administered by the Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, and Teutonic Knights. Meanwhile, on August 20th, the Muslim prisoners enslaved from the city garrison were all put to the sword by Richard's order. Eager to follow the success at Acre with an advance on Jerusalem, the English king led his forces on a long march toward the Holy City in late August, initially aiming to capture the important port of Jaffa on the Mediterranean coast. In the shadow of Richard's knights was Saladin's Ayyubid army, with over 25,000 troops. With Acre lost and the Crusaders having established a strong base in the Middle Levant, Saladin's mission now was to ensure Richard did not reach Jerusalem, that the city not fall again into Christian hands. The rout of the Crusader march gave Saladin an opportunity he quickly exploited. As the Crusaders marched on the coastal road to Jaffa, Saladin would use his numerical superiority over the smaller Christian army to ambush them in the fields north of the ruined castle of Arsuf. In the hot and humid afternoon of September 7, 1191, the armies under the command of two of the greatest generals of the medieval era, Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, would clash in the Battle of Arsuf. Hanging in the balance of this epic engagement was the fate of the Third Crusade. With Acre now under Christian rule, the Crusaders had a base from which to begin operations deeper into the Levant. King Richard was meticulous in his planning for the summer offensive, plotting the route the Crusaders would take in their march into Lower Palestine toward Jerusalem. There were two possible routes the Crusaders could use, both had advantages and disadvantages. The inland route led the army from Acre to Nazareth and then to Jerusalem. This would lead them on a march through broken, rugged terrain, where roads passed through several valleys that Saladin could use as choke points to cut off and ambush the Crusaders. Moreover, Nazareth was 20 miles from Acre, meaning the Crusaders would have to stretch a thin line of communication to link their army back to the supply base at Acre. This would give Saladin an opportunity to cut Richard's supply lines and defeat his army piecemeal. The second route required capturing the major ports in the lower Palestine region, specifically the city of Jaffa. Using coastal roads, the terrain would protect the Crusaders' mounted cavalry and their long baggage train. After taking Jaffa, the Crusaders would move to the much larger port of Ascalon, 30 more miles to the south. Richard could then use these ports as springboards for a later push to Jerusalem itself. The anchorages would also allow direct supply lines for the Crusaders for their eventual siege of Jerusalem. Finally, after much careful deliberation, Richard decided to go with the second route. On August 25, the Crusaders set out from Acre into the sandy plain of Haifa, bringing for the campaign 1,200 knights and 10,000 soldiers and infantry. The Crusaders brought their own rations of water and food, as Saladin was likely to poison wells and pursue a scorched earth policy during the Christian march. To supply the troops on their 130-kilometer journey, a Crusader fleet sailed south 3 days earlier, keeping pace with the army. In this way, Richard could transport troops and supplies from the fleet to the army along the coastal route. The sweltering summer heat during the day meant the Crusaders had to move during the morning hours and pitch camp during the afternoons. All the while, Saladin's army lurked in the shadows of the eastern hills, watching the slow progress of the Crusaders and waiting for the right moment to strike. Saladin would send raiding parties of about 20 to 30 men down the hills to attack the Crusaders at key points of the march, constantly harassing Richard's troops and keeping them on their feet. Many raiders at the rearguard were caught and cut down, as were 400 horses that were irreplaceable on the march. For a short time, the Crusaders' rearguard lost contact with the rest of the column and could have been cut off and completely destroyed if only Saladin's son, Melek El-Athal, had more men available. By the time Saladin received El-Athal's message, it was too late and the Christians at the rear had managed to rejoin the main body. The movement of the Crusaders around the Mount Carmel ridge was a tedious affair, slow in nature due to the difficulty of maintaining contact with naval forces offshore, coupled with constant harassment from Muslim raiders. Nevertheless, Richard continued to maintain his patience, methodically moving his men in the cool early morning and resting them in the hot afternoons. Finally, the Crusader army marched past Haifa, then around Mount Carmel, before stopping at an area known as the Casal of the Narrow Roads. From here, the Christians entered unfamiliar territory as they moved into the plain of Sharon, a swamp covered with dense vegetation. Muslim scouts continued to watch the Crusaders from the hills during their southward movement to Caesarea. Meanwhile, most of Saladin's army camped at Tel Kaiman. Despite suffering from severe blisters on the lower body, the Sultan endured the pain to move between his reconnaissance posts and main camp, keeping track of the Crusaders' movements. When the Christians reached the outskirts of Caesarea, Saladin decided not to attack, guided by his patience and desire to wait for the best moment to strike. He was cautious, not wanting to engage his entire army in the field until reinforcements had arrived from his emirs throughout the Sultanate. Saladin remained undecided for several days as the Crusaders marched into the ghost town that was Caesarea before crossing a stream 3 miles south called the River of the Dead. Skirmishes became fiercer as they moved away from Caesarea and King Richard moved to the middle guard to oversee the formation's defense. Richard briefly halted his army to rest for 3 days, starting September 3, all the while the Crusader fleet kept the men supplied. Meanwhile, Saladin's army entered the forest of Arsuf, a large forest stretching 12 miles north of the ruined town of Arsuf Castle. Arsuf had been destroyed by Saladin during his conquests in 1187, and the broken castle remained standing, serving as a strong reminder of the Sultan's campaign 4 years earlier. As the Crusaders rested in their camp tents, Saladin spent the daylight hours of September 3 through 4 personally scouting their position, searching for a suitable place to launch a full-scale surprise attack. The forest of Arsuf masked the Ayyubids' presence, keeping them within striking distance of the Christian army. It was here, at Arsuf, that Saladin finally sensed the opportunity he had waited for. On the morning of September 5, the Crusaders packed their tents and moved off once more, halting for the afternoon at Wadi al-Falak, not far from the ruins of Arsuf. Richard positioned his men to pitch tents in a field set between the coastline and a large marsh that protected the camp from a surprise attack. During the afternoon, Richard sent an envoy to Saladin's brother, Aladil Sef ad-Din, commonly known by the Crusaders as Saladin, seeking to negotiate possible terms of peace. Saladin, upon learning of this, ordered his brother to stall the talks while reinforcements continued to pour into the Muslim camp, hoping to buy time for his army to build its strength. The next day, Saladin met with King Richard and his envoys. During the talks, Richard demanded that the Muslims surrender all conquered lands of Jerusalem to Guy, to which Saladin was outraged and indignant. Before anything could be done about the discussion, Saladin broke off the talks against his brother's wishes. Nevertheless, Saladin managed to organize his army in the fields south of the forest of Arsuf. The Muslim army totaled 25,000. For several days, King Richard had anticipated a possible attack from Saladin. Thus, in the march for September 7, 1191, he reorganized his columns into 5 fighting divisions. The Templars under Grand Master Robert de Sable held the vanguard, joined by a contingent of Turcopoles, native cavalry who were lightly armed, fast-moving, and trained to counter Muslim raiders. Behind the Templar vanguard and Turcopoles were the Angevins, soldiers from Aquitaine, along with a contingent of Bretons. The 3rd Division consisted of soldiers from Poitou. These 2 divisions were under the command of King Guy. The 4th Division consisted of the English and Normans. Finally, the Knights Hospitallers and French brought up the rear in the 5th Division, overseen by the Grand Master of the Hospitaller Garnier de Nablus. Richard and the Duke of Burgundy rode along the entire length of the march, urging the men to keep ranks compact. Saladin watched as the Crusaders marched closer, allowing them to move a few miles down the road before initiating his offensive. Richard's scouts warned him that Saladin's army was possibly preparing for an attack. Suddenly, Bedouins and Nubian skirmishers emerged and attacked the formation around noon. In the din of blaring horns and beating kettle drums, the Muslim army rushed across the plain to engulf the Crusaders. The Battle of Arsuf had begun. The Crusader knights and infantry prepared for the heavy assault. Egyptian cavalry from Saladin's division descended from the north and attacked the French in the rearguard. Syrian cavalry of Al-Athal hit the French line from the east at the same time. The Knights Hospitallers and their infantry support now suddenly found themselves being attacked from 2 sides. The pressure of the Muslim assault quickly became unbearable for the Hospitallers and French. Muslim squadrons from the left division attacked the Crusader middle guard at the same time in an attempt to pin the enemy and keep them from reinforcing the French and Hospitallers. Meanwhile, Saladin raised his Household Guard Mamluk division to position behind Al-Athal's men. The Mamluks' heavy strike cavalry would now be in place to exploit any gaps carved in the Crusader line in order to engage with Richard's armored knights. The infantry in the Crusader rearguard fought fiercely tooth and nail to hold back the Turkish mounted archers. Crusader knights knocked down many of these light cavalry troops, but they were quickly replaced by fresh horse archers, so that the French could not cope with the assault. Many of Saladin's horse archers chose to dismount so that they could shoot more arrows quickly from their light bows. As the battle dragged on, the Muslim archers managed to kill many of the Hospitallers' mounts, greatly dismaying the knights. The Master Garnier de Nablus sent word to King Richard that their lines could not hold much longer. He insisted that the Hospitallers must launch a charge to break out of their trap. But Richard did not give in to the request. He was very aware that if the Hospital Knights broke formation, it would be disaster for the entire army. Despite being under increased pressure, the Crusader line continued to march south. Richard sensed the frustration in the Muslim ranks at their inability to break the Crusader lines. Garnier soon became angry with Richard's refusal to allow a charge. He shouted at the king through the din of battle, again requesting permission for a charge. Once again, Richard called for patience. Still very troubled, he returned to the rear guard to find his Hospitallers under even greater stress than before, and his knights on the verge of mutiny. "Why don't we charge at full gallop?" they shouted at Master Garnier, to which he had no answer. The Muslims continued to press their advantage against the rear guard. Christian infantry tired from the relentless assaults. Gaps were opening in their ranks as casualties mounted, and the mounted Hospitallers behind them were also coming under a hail of arrows. Around this time, Saladin began to make his presence felt on the battlefield, and his men fought with even greater ferocity and determination, as the Sultan rode back and forth among the ranks, shouting words of encouragement. Just as some of the Egyptian cavalry began to turn the left flank of the French and Hospitaller line and penetrated into the rear of Richard's army, the Crusader infantry rushed along the shore to block their efforts. Master Garnier again requested permission to initiate a charge from Richard, but once more the English king refused him. Richard informed the hospital grandmaster that he would signal a coordinated charge from all lines at the right moment, and not before. Richard sent word to his officers that the signal for a full charge would be given by the sounds of 6 horn blasts. If the Hospitallers were to charge alone, it would disrupt the line and cause chaos. Worse, the attack too soon would give the Muslims an opportunity to maneuver and counterattack. The moment had to be right, and Richard knew this well. If it were the right time, the Muslim cavalry would be unable to resist the assault of the heavy knights mounted on their armored horses. As the Battle of Arsuf dragged throughout the morning, Master Garnier tried to maintain the cohesion of his impatient Hospitallers. They were enraged at the loss of so many of their horses and were eager for payback. Then, without orders, 2 mounted knights broke ranks and charged. One was the Marshal of the Hospital, the other was Baldwin Le Caron, a knight in Richard's household who had joined the fight in the rearguard. They likely mistook 2 blasts from a Muslim horn as the signal for the start of the Christian counterattack. That, or they simply charged of their own volition. Upon seeing his marshal break out of formation, Master Garnier gave the order for his hospital knights to charge the Muslims, with some of the French knights nearby joining the assault. Seeing the Hospitallers break formation, Richard realized it was now or never, and gave the order for the rest of the army to join the assault, with the exception of his Anglo-Norman troops, who remained in place guarding the Crusader standard. Richard and his household cavalry crashed into the Ayyubid ranks with their lances and swords, as Richard fought personally in the thick of the action. Meanwhile, the Crusader vanguard led by King Guy had reached a stand of trees on the northern outskirts of Arsuf. Far from the fighting at the rear, the Templars in the vanguard under Grand Master Robert de Sable stood by, waiting for orders. To the Muslim leadership it appeared that the Crusaders had initiated a well-coordinated attack. Saladin committed his household Mamluk guard, attempting to prevent the Crusaders from destroying his already disorganized army. The heavy-armed Mamluk cavalry were the only troops in Saladin's army who could stand against the mounted Christian knights, who were busy dispersing the Muslim infantry. Richard ordered his knights to halt as they approached near the wooded hills beyond the coastal plain, fearing they would overextend by fighting in the valleys and hills ahead and become ambushed and destroyed. Christian discipline held steady. Not a single feigned retreat could tempt them to charge their enemy. From 3 o'clock in the afternoon, as the midday heat began to ease, Richard gave the order for the crossbowmen to advance beyond their protective shields and ordered his reserve to join him in a powerful attack. He was like a giant in battle, wrote a chronicler. His body was like bronze, impervious to any kind of weapon. His right hand swung his sword with swift blows, cutting the attacking enemy, slicing them in two as he met them. Muslim morale fled amid the assault, and Saladin watched his army slowly melt away once more. All except for a few, because as Richard and his fist of knights were reining in on their mounts, a great shout was heard from Jaffa. Some of their compatriots, exhausted from the constant attacks, had left their posts and fled to the safety of the galleys. Muslim contingents took advantage of their departure to penetrate once more into Jaffa, with hopes of rooting a renewed belief on their side. With seemingly inexhaustible energy, Richard called to himself a handful of knights, fighters, and cavalry. After driving the cowards from the galleys and posting an armed guard to discourage further cowards, the king rode into Jaffa, prompting a quick Saracen retreat. That evening, both rulers counted the cost of the battle. The Muslims had lost 700 dead and 1,500 horses, many of which had remained on the battlefield. The Crusaders suffered only 2 deaths and an unspecified number wounded. Hoping to maintain the illusion of power, Saladin sent word to Richard that he still aimed to take the king and the city. Richard, seriously ill from his efforts of recent days, issued a defiant reply. Nevertheless, both leaders and their armies were so tired that negotiations began again. On September 3, a truce was reached. Hostilities would be suspended for 3 years. The Christians removed Ascalon and Darum and recognized Acre as the new capital of the Holy Land. Jerusalem was left in Muslim hands. In return, Saladin gave his word to protect all Christian pilgrims in Jerusalem. By September 5, large parts of the Muslim army began to disband while others destroyed the fortifications of Ascalon under Crusader supervision. The next day, Richard rode north to Acre. On October 9, he set out for home, or so he thought. The Crusaders' victory in the Siege of Acre in July 1191 opened the way for their march to the city of Jerusalem. King Richard's tactical successes had effectively prevented Saladin's ability to take the initiative, but the Lionheart could not overcome the hidden geographical and strategic advantages held by his Muslim enemy. With increasingly credible evidence that King Philip Augustus of France and his brother John were plotting to seize his Angevin properties, Richard was convinced it was time for him to return home. He concentrated his forces in Acre and waited for favorable winds to take him west, secure in his enemy's extension. He little suspected that Saladin, desperate to regain lost prestige, had gathered his emirs for a final offensive, hoping to deliver a decisive blow that would drive these foreign warriors from the Levant forever. The twin Crusader victories at Acre and Arsuf in 1191 had put Saladin firmly on the defensive. The previous conflict had resulted in considerable losses of material, elite troops, and his entire Egyptian fleet. Although the Muslims had suffered fewer casualties at Arsuf, Saladin's inability to stop Richard's march south toward Jaffa had made him lose face among his emirs. To make matters even worse, the Sultan became seriously ill, depriving him of his trademark charisma that had helped keep his army united. For his part, Richard was becoming increasingly aware of the deeply rooted factionalism within the Crusader states and his army, an environment that seriously threatened the integrity of his multinational force and his mission. He quickly understood that only sustained and offensive operations would keep this turmoil at bay. However, this was a dangerous strategy. Richard could not afford to suffer any setback given the larger Crusader position in the Levant. Moreover, any move would either require broad logistical support from a region unsuited to supply it, or be supplied from outside at potentially prohibitive cost. All the while, the split between the Crusader states would further complicate the supply chain. Oddly enough, both leaders began seeking a quick, decisive campaign that would deliver a knockout blow and force the other into a negotiated settlement. Richard was quick to seize the initiative. Jaffa fell without a fight on September 10, just 3 days after the Battle of Arsuf, and immediately began rebuilding the city's walls and dry moat. Securing this vital port, closest to Jerusalem, presented Richard with two alternatives: continue coastward toward Ascalon and Darum, threatening Saladin's strategic base in Egypt, or push inland toward the Holy City. Unable to defend against both options, Saladin leveled Ascalon's defenses and expelled its inhabitants, leaving only a covering force under one of his sons, Al-Afdal, nearby. With dissident emirs and their retinues leaving daily, the Sultan was forced to leave a small fraction of defenders in Darum and other fortified positions to the south and concentrated his personal group in Jerusalem. In blocking the land routes to Egypt, Saladin correctly understood Richard's intentions. In October 1191, the English king came to the conclusion that an Egyptian campaign would exert the greatest pressure on Saladin. As a major source of wealth and highly trained troops, Egypt was the backbone of Saladin's war effort. Thus, Richard began contracting with Pisan and Genoese captains to assemble a fleet at Acre. However, neither group was willing to risk their ships so close to the end of sailing season. Worse, the powerful French faction in Richard's army, under Hugh of Burgundy, saw Egypt as an insignificant objective and refused to join the campaign. Their sole aim was Jerusalem. On the other hand, Robert de Sable, Grand Master of the Templars, and Garnier de Napoli, Grand Master of the Hospitallers, asked Richard to decide quickly on the next course of action and press the advantage gained at Acre and Arsuf. But Richard, against his better judgment, pushed off the offensive on Egypt until the following summer. And to placate the French and keep his army intact, he decided to march inland toward Jerusalem. The Crusader victories at Acre and Arsuf should have been decisive. What was unfolding in Richard's own camp was something even the battlefield triumphs could not overcome: a fracturing coalition that would ultimately cost him the Holy City itself. Crusader morale stood at a high level through the fall, however the king moved with some misgivings. Rumors had reached him that Philip Augustus, his former Crusader comrade, had begun plotting to seize his Angevin domains at home. It was at this moment the English king opened negotiations with Saladin. The Sultan, his forces considerably reduced and demoralized, was eager to listen and extend counterproposals, although no agreement was reached. The Crusaders' advance was steady in the city of Ramla, 20 kilometers from Jaffa, fell on November 17. However, over the next month, daily skirmishes became more intensive. Few casualties resulted from these attacks, but they exhausted the Crusader force and progress slowed to a crawl. Nor did the increasingly cold and rainy weather help moods. By Christmas of 1191, Richard's forces were not even halfway to Jerusalem. With internal tensions reaching a climax, Richard halted at Beit Nuba and held a war council. The Grand Masters of both orders asked Richard to consider the vulnerability of his position and withdraw, while the French faction again called for further advance on Jerusalem. At the conclusion of Christmas celebrations on January 8, 1192, Richard ordered a withdrawal, framing the move as a positive move toward Ascalon to reduce the damaging effect on his army's morale. The undefended city fell quickly, however Richard's decision to fortify it in anticipation of his Egyptian offensive would ultimately prove to be the sticking point in negotiations for the next 8 months. After this, there was little military activity until spring, although neither commander would enjoy the rest. Saladin failed to launch a winter campaign for the first time in 4 years, as a result of increasing opposition from his northern emirs in the Jazira. Richard spent much of that time fortifying Jaffa's defenses, a decision that would pay significant dividends in the near future. In late April 1192, Richard received news from the prior of Hereford that his brother John had overthrown Longchamps, the Lionheart's appointed chancellor and regent, and was now ruling England in Richard's name. Increasingly desperate to resolve matters in the east and return home, the king concentrated his forces at Jaffa. Saladin, aware he still lacked the necessary strength to stop the Crusaders, and assuming the Holy City was still the objective, poisoned or filled the wells on the approaches to Jerusalem. He also initially sent his young son, Alathil, and later his trusted brother, Aladil, north to bring the Jazira in line. News of the Sultan's weakness and the departure of his vassals quickly reached the Crusader camp, and Richard rushed forward, capturing the key post of Darum after a 5-day siege on May 23. Darum's fall meant Richard now held the last major castle on the road to Egypt. Saladin's strategic base was now seriously threatened. Once again Richard was presented with the choice: Egypt or Jerusalem. Again, debates flared about what were the best means to bring Saladin to the negotiating table, and again his army was bitterly divided. In the absence of any clear answer from Saladin, who had stubbornly held out throughout the previous summer, and with good sailing weather for at least 5 more months, striking Egypt was the logical choice. But Richard chose to continue toward Jerusalem. This time his army moved faster, covering territory that had taken him months in just days. Even the king's illness could not slow them, and the army camped at Beit Nuba in early June. A few days later, while hunting, the Lionheart saw the distant walls of Jerusalem, but once again, Crusader momentum slowed. The overextended supply lines from Jaffa and the growing realization that he lacked the manpower and equipment for a full siege weighed heavily on Richard. The approach of St. John's Day, the 24th, traditionally marked the beginning of the dry season in Palestine. With Saladin successfully blocking wells and cisterns, Richard's nearest water supply would be 2 miles away from the city itself. A simple assault on the Holy City, urged by the French knights, would result in casualties he could not afford, but he had no other decisive options. On June 23, after receiving word from Bedouin spies that a large caravan was approaching Jerusalem from Egypt, Richard led a surprise attack, taking a bounty of food, pack horses, and camels. The survivors fled into the city, further demoralizing morale throughout the Muslim army. On July 1, in extremis and with many of his emirs fearing they would meet the same fate as Acre's defenders, Saladin called a war council that lasted 3 days. Here his charisma won out. Taking personal command of the army, he led it outside the walls of Jerusalem for a final confrontation with Richard. However, to his amazement, as his army moved toward Beit Nuba, there was no sign of the Crusader army. Richard had chosen to abandon his assault on the Holy City once again and was withdrawing toward Ramlah. Saladin could not believe his good luck. As the Crusader army withdrew, its cohesion quickly dissolved. The French knights moved north toward Caesarea, while the English king went initially to Jaffa, where he left a small force of weak and wounded soldiers, and from there marched to Acre, along the same coastal route he had traveled a year earlier. Be not deceived by my retreat. The ram withdraws too, but harder. Richard to Saladin. Richard hoped to mask the gravity of the situation by reopening negotiations with a harsh tone, so Saladin would not realize the Crusaders were withdrawing. The bluff worked. But the Sultan, for his part, used Ascalon's fortifications as a tool to prolong negotiations, while he quietly gathered reinforcements from Egypt and waited for additional troops to come from the now pacified Jazira. Although his army of 7,000 to 10,000 men was now much larger than his enemies, Saladin remained at Beit Nuba, biding his time. The moment he arrived at Acre on July 26, Richard assembled a fleet of 36 galleys. Sending a portion north to Beirut, That evening he publicly sought the blessing of both Grand Masters for a forthcoming voyage. Word quickly reached Saladin, who believed all signs pointed to Richard departing for home and decided to strike quickly. All that evening and through the night, his men moved, arriving before the walls of Jaffa early in the morning of July 27th. Since the Muslim army, composed of a large corps of Arab and Bedouin cavalry, with a small elite of armored Kurdish and Turkish Mamluks, was ill-suited for siege operations, Saladin ordered an immediate assault on the city. The small Christian garrison was surprised. The Sultan's men, motivated by the prospect of a quick victory, pushed back the defenders. But Richard's fortifications proved their worth and the Muslims were beaten back. Most importantly, the garrison was able to send word to Richard, requesting his aid. For 3 days the Christians prayed for their relief, while a frustrated Saladin brought out 6 siege engines to hasten their fall. By July 31st, these machines had destroyed Jaffa's eastern gate and the surrounding wall. "Forward," Saladin shouted, directing the assault ahead of the elite Mamluks. A Christian soldier noticed the dust shaking in the stone walls as the Sultan's charge thundered toward the city. The Muslim cavalry overran the breach, defeating the defenders. Unable to hold their position, the Christians broke into smaller formations, fighting on foot as the battle moved into the streets. However, after an hour of fierce fighting, the Christians were driven back. Those lucky ran for shelter in the castle. Others, however, were caught in the brutal sacking of the city. The assault completely shattered the nerves of Aubry de Reims, commander of Jaffa's defense, but the Christian cause was saved by the actions of Ralph, the newly consecrated Bishop of Bethlehem. With perfect skill, the prelate negotiated a brief truce with Saladin, expiring at the 9th hour of the following day. If Richard could not relieve Jaffa by then, all would be lost. But the king? When news of Saladin's attack reached Acre on the morning of the 28th, the king immediately sent cries through the streets calling all available men to this desperate relief expedition. All except the French answered the call. That same day, a detachment of Templars and Hospitallers set out by land, while Richard boarded his royal ship, Trenchemere, and, accompanied by 6 other galleys, headed south with favorable winds. Unfortunately for the Crusaders, fate and Saladin had other plans. The Sultan, anticipating Richard's relief efforts, had erected a number of roadblocks for ambushes stopping the military orders just beyond Caesarea. Then, after a day at sea, the wind died, leaving Richard's galleys stalled near Haifa, facing the insurmountable task of rowing the rest of the way. Fervent prayers remained unanswered for 3 days until, on the morning of the 31st, the winds rose once more. Urging his men to greater efforts, Richard and 2 other galleys outstripped the others, reaching Jaffa by the end of the night. But had he arrived in time? The early light of the morning of August 1st revealed Muslim banners along the walls as far as the eye could see. To make matters even worse, soldiers positioned on the beach began to open fire to prevent a landing. Richard's heart must have sunk in despair. Suddenly, a priest from the castle leaped from the wall to the sand below. Miraculously avoiding the Muslim soldiers, he ran to the shore and swam to Richard's ship. Sometime later, he climbed aboard. Stopping, he told Richard about the remnants of the Christian garrison holding in the castle and the truce that would end after a few hours. The news was electric. Richard, still only partially armored, immediately ordered his galleys toward the shore. The moment they landed, Richard grabbed a bow and threw himself into waist-deep water, followed by his companion. As the astonished Muslims watched, Richard shot his bolt, drew his sword, and charged. The heavily armored Crusaders penetrated right through the thick formation of Muslim warriors. Although only a small group landed with Richard, their swords and spears cleared that path for the others who reached the shore. Astonished by the Lionheart's courage, Saladin's men turned and fled from the beach into Jaffa, with the enemy on foot. The battle moved into the city, as more and more Crusaders rushed onto the beach to join the assault, inspired by Richard's bravery. Back at the citadel, the Christian could hear the unexpected battle taking place. Then, the sight of the king's lion standard flying from the outer walls gave renewed hope. As fighting became more intensive and spread deeper into the streets, the defenders inside the castle steeled themselves before emerging from their shelter. The immediate goal was to link up with Richard's host. However, Saladin's men fought hard, managing to slow the spearhead of the Christian assault. Filled with Muslim warriors, Richard's contingent suffered losses as it made its way toward the castle. Some groups in his entourage were separated in the chaos, as Saladin's men ruthlessly tried to stem the tide. But the Christian forces eventually united. A renewed push was underway. Together, they threw the Muslim army into confusion, drowning them in the streets. What had been a fierce battle moments before turned into a rout. The Sultan, just raised in his tent, could do nothing. His entire camp was utterly engulfed in panic, as troops tried to escape the blockade. Gradually, the Muslim army spilled out of the city and order would not be restored for several hours, until they reached Yazr, a few kilometers away. As daylight faded, both armies endured a sleepless night. Men repaired their equipment, collected weapons from the fallen, and made preparations for tomorrow's battle. That same evening, Saladin was furious in his camp. Richard's unexpected appearance had astonished him and he demanded an effective response from his vassals. A brilliant commander himself, Saladin was aware he was still much larger than the Christian army and, sensing an insurmountable hit to morale if he ordered a retreat, the Sultan knew he had to make a counterattack. The sooner the better, while Richard was still disorganized and Jaffa's defenders still weakened. Gathering his forces over the next 2 days, he planned an operation that would display cunning and power. Richard anticipated Saladin would strike again and responded with careful planning and audacity. Despite suffering from periods of fever, he divided his time between repairing the breach with his men and receiving some of Saladin's emirs, boasting of his plans to stay in the Holy Land until the coming Easter. Richard also welcomed reinforcements under Count Henry of Champagne, accompanied by Hospitallers and Templars, and some horses from Caesarea. By nightfall on August 4th, Richard could count on 55 knights and 15 horses of indifferent quality, and about 2,000 to 3,000 fierce Genoese and Pisan crossbowmen. He boldly came out and camped with some knights outside Jaffa, on the same terrain as Saladin a week earlier. Around midnight, members of Saladin's bodyguard set out toward the Christian camp, aiming to capture Richard. This was the first part of the Sultan's plan, to be followed by a diversionary strike on Jaffa, while the main assault would eliminate the leaderless Christians in the field. As fate would have it, a Genoese crossbowman, walking outside the camp in the early hours of August 5th, saw the shimmer of helmets from Saladin's guard, which had apparently cooled. He ran back into camp, shouting a warning. Quickly awakened, Richard threw on his chain mail and prepared for action. With the left reinforced by the fortified church of St. Nicholas and with his right wheeled around the walls of Jaffa, Richard proposed an active defense, relying on his crossbowmen, whom he positioned in pairs, one loading, one shooting at all times. In front protected the infantry, with spears, fixed in the ground at an angle and holding a shield to dodge arrows. Scattered tent stakes, half buried, were placed to slow the expected assault. Richard himself, with a handful of mounted knights, formed a mobile reserve. As the enemy got ready, he addressed his men, "Adversity reveals virtues, as prosperity hides them. Besides, there is nowhere to flee, so you must remain determined. True men must either triumph with courage or die with glory." The Muslim army, confident in their large numbers, poured against the Christian ranks. Wave after wave was stopped at the line of spears and retreated before the deadly hail of crossbow fire. Just as at Arsuf, Richard had a sixth sense to rush up and down the line, appearing at every critical moment. Christian discipline held steady. Not a single feigned retreat could lure them to charge their enemy. From 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when the midday heat began to ease, Richard gave the order for the crossbowmen to advance beyond their protective shields and ordered his reserve to join him in a powerful attack. He was like a giant in battle, wrote a chronicler. His body was like bronze, impervious to any kind of weapon. His right hand swung his sword with swift blows, cutting the attacking enemy, slicing them in two as he met them. Muslim morale fled amid the assault and Saladin watched his army slowly melt away once more. All except for a few, because as Richard and his fist of knights were reining in on their mounts, a great shout was heard from Jaffa. Some of their compatriots, exhausted from the constant attacks, had left their posts and fled to the safety of the galleys. Muslim contingents took advantage of their departure to penetrate once more into Jaffa, with hopes of rooting a renewed belief on their side. With seemingly inexhaustible energy, Richard called to himself a handful of knights, fighters, and cavalry. After driving the cowards from the galleys and posting an armed guard to discourage further cowards, the king rode into Jaffa, prompting a quick Saracen retreat. That evening, both rulers counted the cost of the battle. The Muslims had lost 700 dead and 1,500 horses, many of which had remained on the battlefield. The Crusaders suffered only 2 deaths and an unspecified number wounded. Hoping to maintain the illusion of power, Saladin sent word to Richard that he still aimed to take the king and the city. Richard, seriously ill from his efforts of recent days, issued a defiant reply. Nevertheless, both leaders and their armies were so tired that negotiations began again. On September 3, a truce was reached. Hostilities would be suspended for 3 years. The Christians removed Ascalon and Durham and recognized Acre as the new capital of the Holy Land. Jerusalem was left in Muslim hands. In return, Saladin gave his word to protect all Christian pilgrims in Jerusalem. By September 5, large parts of the Muslim army began to disband while others destroyed the fortifications of Ascalon under Crusader supervision. The next day, Richard rode north to Acre. On October 9, he set out for home. The truce lasted for some reason. Richard's capture of Cyprus with its abundant food supply gave the Crusader kingdoms little incentive to push beyond their narrow coastal strip. For the Muslims, the moral energy generated by Saladin when he proclaimed jihad in 1187 was simply exhausted. Moreover, the Sultan's sudden death in March 1193 shattered his kingdom, with one son, Al-Aziz, ruling in Egypt and another, Al-Athal, controlling Syria. The subsequent fighting was not resolved until the Mongol conquests of the 1250s, which threatened the Near East more than the Crusaders. Only a renewed spirit of jihad would push these invaders back at Ain Jalut and then continue to dismantle the remaining Crusader kingdoms. On a personal level, the Third Crusade provides us with two leaders who, despite their cultural differences, came to power in an atmosphere of religious zeal and knife-edge politics. The fact that they were able to overcome these conditions and treat each other as honorable men, albeit chivalrously, is extraordinary. For military history enthusiasts around the world, Acre, Arsuf and Jaffa cemented King Richard's reputation as the embodiment of a bold ruler and a charismatic warrior, just as Saladin's victory at Hattin and his conquest of the imposing castles of the Holy Land affirmed him as one of the greatest leaders in the Muslim world. While other rulers withdrew from a protracted war, Richard and Saladin remained committed. Yet where others single-mindedly pursued time-worn strategic objectives, the English king and the Ayyubid Sultan were able to grasp the intricacies of holding the Holy City and sought creative ways to achieve a more lasting peace in Palestine. With indomitable spirit, capable of triumphing under challenging conditions and against incredible odds, these two men had rightly earned their place in history. But here is what historians still debate. Had Richard stayed just 6 more months, had he ignored the treachery brewing in England, would Jerusalem have fallen? Every crusade that followed tried to answer that question. None of them succeeded.